bibliophiles of the internet. Today I thought I would share some if you like this, read that book recs. I feel like most of us are familiar with this format. I'm going to share a popular or hopefully familiar title and recommend another book you should read if you enjoyed the first. Quick disclaimer, I have personally read a vast majority of these books on either side of the equation, but there are one or two where I'm just going off my best educated guess because they were something I just really wanted to recommend. But hopefully it all tracks. Also, all of these recommendations go in either direction. So if you've read the book I'm recommending, but not the book I'm basing the recommendation off of, you can go in that direction as well. And I think even if you haven't read the book, but if you're interested in it, that also works. I like to think of all of these as balanced equations, and the answers are correct no matter which side you land on. Let's start with the pairing that sort of inspired this video, that got the wheels turning, so to speak. And so I'm gonna say if you enjoyed They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Abdurraqib, you would also most likely really enjoy Boys in the Void by Jira Asim. First of all, credit where credit is due. I have to give a huge shout out to my friend Beck from Mooney Reads by Starlight, who recommended this book to me a few years ago, and I'm so glad that they did. Much like They Can't Kill Us, this is a nonfiction book about music with a particular look at how music influences identity, how the art we love shapes how we understand ourselves and make ourselves legible in the world, and with an even more specific focus on what it means to navigate the punk music scene and by extension, the world, as someone who is Black. The book is actually structured as a sort of mixtape for Jira's younger brother. So each chapter is the author taking a punk song and sort of annotating it, parsing out how it's connected to his own lived experiences, and also how it embodies advice that his younger brother might take away for himself. I've paired these two books together not only because they're these slim volumes of music writing that are unassuming on the surface, but deeply emotional and intellectual as you dive into them, but because both authors are also incredibly sharp, intentional, and deeply observant when it comes to the human condition, and the way they use music as a pathway to get at some of the most pressing issues and questions of our time is just amazing. Even though tonally and stylistically these essay collections are approaching music in very different ways, they both made me feel like my brain was breaking apart in the best possible way. There is something so incredibly special about both of these books. While we're talking about Hanif's work, I also happen to think that if you love There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension, then you should read A Sharp Endless Need by Marisa Crane. Now, I will say I haven't read There's Always This Year yet, but I've read excerpts and essays from it. I understand the vibes, and I think the vibes here are a perfect fit. Also, obviously, There's Always This Year is nonfiction, while A Sharp Endless Need is fiction, so they do diverge in that respect. But A Sharp Endless Need is a hazy, queer, coming-of-age story about a young basketball player named Mac, whose world is turned upside down as she goes into her senior year of high school. First, she very suddenly loses her father, and secondly, there's a new hotshot transfer student who also transfers onto Mac's team, and they discover they have this intense, game-winning chemistry both on and off the court. Stylistically, I really and truly believe that these two books come from the same family tree. They share DNA in so many ways. They have a relationship to each other not only because they're emotionally evocative narratives that revolve around basketball to varying degrees, but because they're written in a way that will break your heart. Hanif is also a poet, so he brings that sensibility to all of his writing, that attention to flow and breath and energy. And as I said in my author taste test vlog, I feel like the writing in A Sharp Endless Need is about as damn close to poetry as prose can get. And I also did say in that same vlog that I feel like these two books would make really great companions to each other, that you would most likely have an incredible experience if you read them side by side or back to back. And in fact, Marisa Crane actually quotes Hanif Abdurraqib at the beginning of the book, and I think also mentions him in the acknowledgements. So I kind of feel like I nailed it in one. Both books in this next pairing are fairly new, so it's possible you haven't read either of them, but I'm still gonna go ahead and say that if you enjoyed or even have interest in Cosmic Love at the Multiverse Hair Salon, you should also read Coffee Shop in an Alternate Universe by C.B. Lee. Now, just to be exceedingly clear, Cosmic Love is an adult romance, and Coffee Shop is a YA fantasy with a prominent romantic subplot, so please do be aware of the intended audiences for both books and go into them with the appropriate expectations. To really boil it down, basically both of these books are full of decadent sapphic yearning and focused on sapphic romance that spans timelines and even universes. Cosmic Love at the Multiverse Hair Salon is a mixture of sci-fi, speculative fiction, and romance about a hairstylist who mistakenly receives a text message from a wrong number that turns into something incredibly flirtatious. But she ends up getting ghosted when the two of them try to meet, and then she later learns that this text exchange might have been physically impossible because the person she was texting has been missing without her phone for months. Coffee Shop in an Alternate Universe has a sort of similar conceit, but leans more in a cozy adjacent fantasy direction. It's about a chronic overachiever named Brenda who's desperately trying to submit a scholarship application right as the deadline's gonna pass, which is of course when there's a huge citywide Wi-Fi outage. Desperate to connect to the internet somewhere, she stumbles into this cafe that she's never seen before and is instantly charmed by the incredibly charismatic, incredibly cute barista named Kat. They flirt with each other, they exchange numbers, they agree to go out on a date, but what neither of them realizes is that they're from two overlapping universes that are not meant to be connected. So if they want to go on that date, they're gonna have to get a little bit creative. Again, this is not a one-to-one match by any means. Not only do both books have different genre leanings, but they're also intended for very different audiences, as I said. But I will say this, if I had a nickel for every time I read a dreadfully romantic story about two sapphics absolutely yearning out of their minds for each other across time and space, across impossible dimensions, and literally reworking the universe so that they can be together, I would have 2 nickels, but it is weird that it happened twice. This next pairing is kind of a leap of faith because I'm actually partway through the first book I'm gonna mention, but the vibes are so very strong, so I'm gonna be brave and say that if you like The Bullet Swallower by Elizabeth Gonzalez James, you might also like The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su by Tom Lin. Again, to boil these down to their most essential parts, both of these books are Western revenge tales that actively and aggressively de-center whiteness. The Bullet Swallower is a story following disparate generations of the same Mexican family, beginning with a notorious bandido in 1895 who attempts to rob a train laden with gold only to end up on a quest of ruthless vengeance, a burden and a debt that his descendants generations later might have to pay themselves. The Thousand Crimes of Ming Su, on the other hand, is a western about a Chinese-American man who ends up falling for the daughter of a powerful railroad magnate, and then his wife is suddenly kidnapped and he is forced into conscripted service to build the Central Pacific Railroad. And years later, he manages to free himself and he sets off on a quest to rescue his spouse and exact revenge on the men who destroyed his life. I feel like the parallels here are pretty self-explanatory. Both of these stories, to some degree, follow an epic quest for revenge that is both deeply emotional and cathartic, and they also explore the experience of inherited trauma and wanting to rage against the systems that brought that trauma to your doorstep, so to speak. Next, we have another pairing where both books are fairly new, so I could have put them in interchangeable positions really, but either way, I think if you enjoyed or would like to read Roll for Love by M.K. England, you should also read The No Girlfriend Rule by Kristen Randall. These are both nerdy sapphic romances where two characters involved in tabletop role-playing campaigns are playing characters who fall for each other in the game, while they themselves are falling for each other in real time and in real life. The No Girlfriend Rule in particular is about a queer, fat, anxious teenager named Hollis who desperately wants to get into tabletop gaming, but her boyfriend's long-standing SNS group has a rule that girlfriends and significant others cannot join the ongoing campaign. So she has to find a whole other group of people to learn from and play with, which is how she discovers an all-girls game of SNS that's starting from scratch, and she maybe begins to fall for one of them and also begins to learn the real meaning of friendship. I think there's so much overlap between these two stories in the best possible way. They kind of have this dual storyline dynamic to them because tabletop gaming is a significant plot point in both stories. And they're also about nerdy sapphic crushes and discovering things like self-confidence and true community through the gaming experience. To be fully transparent, again, I have not yet read Roll for Love, but the synopses of both books match up so incredibly well, and also I have never read an M.K. England book that I did not like, so I feel pretty confident. This next pairing isn't quite as obvious or intuitive, so just stick with me for a second, but I think if you liked or if you would like to read The Other Olympians, you should also read The Lilac People by Milo Todd. Now, this is another case where I'm comparing nonfiction to fiction, so it's not going to be a perfect match, but these two books do have quite a bit of historical overlap because they're both partially exploring what it meant to be queer and trans in Berlin during World War II in the late 1930s and 40s. The Other Olympians is excavating the history of queer and especially trans athletes and the gender surveillance they encountered upon trying to qualify for and compete in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. The Lilac People, on the other hand, is following a young trans man both in pre- and post-war Berlin who has to stay in hiding even after the Allies come to liberate those under Nazi rule because being transgender was still considered a death sentence. And it's basically about him, his girlfriend, and a trans Holocaust survivor who stumbles onto their property as they try to escape to the States. Again, narratively, there's not much overlap between these two books, I will admit, but I found myself thinking a lot about The Other Olympians when I was reading The Lilac People, because I think they both do such a great job of excavating what was really an incredibly radical moment for trans people in history pre-World War II that a lot of people don't know about. A lot of people assume that things like gender-affirming surgery, hormones, social transition, name changes, etc. are relatively new developments in trans history when actually they've been around for centuries. And there was actually a lot of legal framework in place, at least pre-World War II, that allowed trans people to actually live their lives as themselves. Just like now, that doesn't mean it was easy or accessible to everyone. It doesn't mean the system worked for everyone, but there was actually a lot of acceptance during this time period that we often only credit to modern day sensibilities or advancements. So ultimately, I love that both of these books excavate and restore these lesser known moments of trans history that are so powerful and so foundational. My next pairing is a little more obvious. I think if you enjoy The Tainted Cup, you would also really love the Masa and Pleiti novella series. These are both mystery series starring a Sherlock and Watson inspired duo, and they both have a delightful genre twist. The Tainted Cup has more of a fantasy lean, but the Masa and Pleiti series, on the other hand, is a sci-fi series. It's set entirely on the planet Jupiter, and it's about an enigmatic investigator named Masa who gets reconnected with her former flame, a young scholar at the university named Pleiti, and they solve mysteries together in space. I think there's actually a lot of overlap between both of these series, even though they occupy different genres and have different structural approaches, one being long form, one being short form, but they both center queer characters, and every installment in both series follows episodic, self-contained mysteries that tie into a larger picture, but also comfortably stand on their own. They both explore that Holmes-Watson dynamic in really satisfying ways, while putting a refreshing spin on that relationship dynamic at the same time. One is a romantic relationship, the other is more of a quirky friendship or companionship, but in both cases, the Sherlock character and the Watson character really complement each other in a way that's fun, entertaining, and engaging to read. Next up, if you enjoyed Futbolista, as you absolutely should, then you should definitely pick up You Don't Have a Shot by Raquel Marie. Again, to be clear, Futbolista is a new adult romance, You Don't Have a Shot is a young adult romance, so approach them both with the appropriate expectations, but basically these are both queer Latinx soccer romances and coming-of-age stories. You Don't Have a Shot is about this hotshot soccer player named Vale whose entire future is wrapped up in the game, and she is so intense about it that she actually gets into a physical fight with her longtime rival during the playoffs. Afterwards, she is appropriately humiliated and humbled by her team and her coach, and she decides to get as far away from the situation as she can by going to her childhood soccer camp for the summer with her friends, only to find out that she and Leticia, her rival, will be co-captaining a team together that is going to play in front of college scouts. This is definitely one of those cases where I struggled to decide which book should be at the forefront here, because I highly recommend both of these. Futbolista is a little bit newer, so it's not ultra popular yet, but I still feel like You Don't Have a Shot is vastly underrated and deserves so much more love. Again, these are both very queer, very Latina sports romances that revolve around soccer, and they're both about disaster queer characters who are absolutely chaotic, although on very different ends of the chaos spectrum, and they're also destructive in some ways and have to make a lot of mistakes on the path towards understanding themselves and loving themselves. I'm gonna switch things up a little bit for this next recommendation because I'm gonna recommend a book based off a movie, because I think if you loved Sinners, again, as you should, and you left that theater thinking to yourself, I want to read something that feels just like this, then I don't understand why you haven't picked up Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. I really don't want to be reductive to either of these absolutely incredible stories, but all the vibes you love from Sinners are absolutely present and prevalent in Ring Shout. But instead of vampires, Ring Shout is about fighting back against members of the KKK who are literal demons. So Ring Shout is this dark, action-packed fantasy thriller. It's also a novella, which is really great. It's set in the early 1900s when the Ku Kluxes, as these demons are called, are spreading across America and gaining serious influence. But the main character, Marisa, and her band of resistance fighters are armed to the teeth, and they are determined to send these demons back to hell where they belong. Again, even though both of these stories are absolutely distinctive and stand on their own, there is quite a bit of overlap between the two. There's even a bit of a musical component in Ring Shout and an exploration of how music connects to history and spiritual power. There's a community foothold where the characters have an epic showdown, and of course that spirit of radical resistance to white supremacy specifically is very much the story's center. I'm just gonna leave it at that. I feel like the comparisons make themselves. Penultimately, I think if you love the space between Between Worlds, then you should definitely pick up Time's Agent by Brenda Peinado. This is a queer Latina sci-fi novella set in the distant future where pocket universes have become commonplace and also incredibly commodified. And Raquel, the main character, is a now disgraced archaeologist whose wife lives in a pocket universe that she wears in a necklace. So her wife no longer speaks to her, what's left of their daughter's consciousness resides in a robotic dog, and time has become a commodity that is controlled and exploited by countless corporations. There's a lot going on in this short little novella, but that's basically the crux of it. And the reason why I relate this book to The Space Between Worlds is because they're both beautifully written, they're incredibly ambitious in their complex world building, and they both kind of break open your brain in the best possible way because of the ways they play with time and space. I find both of these stories to be really fascinating, really twisty thought experiments that explore how humankind has a really bad knack for exploiting new forms of technology and using them in incredibly destructive, self-serving ways. Lastly for today, I thought I would pair up two queer horror graphic novels for your consideration. I think if you like something like Let Me Out by Emmett Nahill and George Williams, then you might also enjoy something like Boys Weekend by Maddie Lubchansky. Both of these books are sort of weird, gory, disturbing queer horror stories told as comics. Let Me Out is more of a take on religious horror and takes a very literal approach to the satanic panic craze in the 80s. Boys Weekend, however, is about a trans femme non-binary character whose old friend has invited her to this bachelor weekend because he and the rest of the crew haven't really gotten the memo in regards to her transness. But she tries to be a good sport and they go off to this hedonistic island floating out in international waters where there's no holds barred in regards to debauchery. And Sammy, the main character, is the only one who seems to realize that they're sharing their swanky hotel with a weird, bloodthirsty cult. There's definitely a lot of elements that these two stories share. They both follow these large groups of characters who are encountering something strange and dark beneath the surface. Both stories have the characters contending with evil, demonic forces that hide themselves behind very convincing masks. And of course, both stories have queer and trans characters fighting back against those forces that are desperately trying to destroy them. So there's an element of catharsis in both. If this is your niche, I think you would really enjoy either or both of these books. There you have it. Those are all the books I had to recommend for today. Of course, if any of the books I mentioned on either side of the equation here remind you of something that you loved, feel free to drop that down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.